piece on the wheel, you're going to need only a handful of tools. The main tools you'll use are your needle tool. Always need a sponge. It's good to have your metal and wooden ribs for shaping and smoothing out the surface of your clay. You're going to want your wooden knife tool for creating your undercut or the bevel at the bottom of your piece. And you're going to want your wire tool to cut it off at the end. Okay. The other thing that I usually keep in my wheel is I like to have my big cleanup sponge with me. That's where I set all my tools. That's where I set any clay bits that I cut off the wheel. It helps me to keep my wheel a little bit cleaner. Okay. When you start your work, you want to start off with something that is relatively round. You want your clay piece, if you're doing a cylinder, to be about 1.25 pounds or to 1.5 pounds. And you want to make sure that your bat, which is this BAT bat that sits on top of the bolts here, you want to make sure that that's nice and clean, but also dry. So I always try to get all the water and the moisture off of that before I put my clay down on here. Okay. Now when I put my clay onto the bat, I don't have to chuck this down super hard. I can just tap it on there with a little bit of force and push down. I get my piece in the center first, pick it up a couple inches, and slap it down on top of there. That should be good and stuck. Okay. If you have a hard time aiming and your piece ends up being way out here and you start spinning your wheel and it moves like crazy, then you might want to just adjust it, move it back, and give it a good push down. Okay. You don't have to chuck this thing down like you're throwing a baseball. Just get it slapped on there, push down on it, and it should be stuck. Okay. Now the first step to this is centering. When you're centering, there's two things that are important. One, you need to have one hand that pushes in on the clay, and you need to have one hand that pushes down. When you're pushing down on the clay, there's a couple different ways you can do that. You can use your palm to push down, you can use the side of your hand like a karate chop, and you can also use your fist. Okay, this is sort of a preference thing. Try all three, do which one you think you like the best. Okay, the hand that pushes in can be your left hand or it can be your right hand. I'm lefty, I push a little bit more with my left hand, but that doesn't mean that righties would have to push with their right hand. Again, this is just a comfort thing. Figure out what works for you. Okay? You need to have enough water on your hands so that they're slippery. If I don't use any water, this piece is just going to come right off the wheel. When you get water, you don't have to put so much water on here that you flood the entire thing. Just get your hands wet, let the drips kind of drip off in the water bucket, and then that's enough clay, or that's enough water to wet the clay. Okay? So what I'm going to be shooting for is something that is about 1/2 of a sphere shape, or you could shoot for like a tuna can shape. So something like that would be okay, and something a little bit more rounded, like 1/2 a sphere, would also be okay. Now, if this is your first try, it's not going to be that easy. Usually, beginners, when they start this, they look like this. And their clay is spinning around, it's not centered, and sometimes you're going too fast, and then it's really moving your hands like crazy, and you just end up with something that's way, way, way out of center. Okay? You try to find the right speed on your wheel. You don't want to be going too fast, but you don't want to be going too slow either. There's kind of a window there, the sweet spot. So with your hand that you push in, I can fix this wobble by putting my arm into my stomach, scooting up all the way to the wheel, and making sure my nose is over the center of the clay. And I'm going to push in with this hand and use my body to not let my hand move. If the clay is moving my hand and it keeps moving like this, I'll never be able to center anything. I have to get my hand to stay steady and lock it into place. Okay? Meanwhile, you're doing that, you have to also be pushing down at the same time. So again, I push down more with my palm, but you could try a karate chop method where you take the side of your hand and you push down with the side of your hand. That's nice because you can actually see the surface of the clay. You can also, okay, get this centered. I can also use my fist to push down. Okay? Now, what you guys don't notice that I'm doing, I'm just doing it in my head, is I'm adjusting my pressure where I need to change the shape of this. So if I'm centering this and it's centering too tall, then that means I need to push down a little bit more on it and not push in so hard. If I'm getting, sometimes beginners get a centered piece of clay that looks like a mushroom kind of, where the base here is really narrow and the top is really wide. Usually that's because you're allowing your hand to cup underneath the clay. So I need to, in my brain, I need to recognize that, and I need to make the adjustment and put my hand maybe more at an angle to get that to go away. So again, if I'm pushing in too much at the bottom, it makes that indent. If I'm pushing down right, kind of actually at an angle this way, it gives me just the right shape. Okay? The next step then, step number 2, is opening. The first step is pulling. The second step is opening. When you open a piece, I recommend keeping your hand on the side where it was when you were centering and using a thumb and your index finger to push down at a 45-degree angle. Do not ever push straight down. If you push straight down, you're likely to get it off center, and then you're going to have a wobble in your piece, and it's going to throw you off down the road. So you push in at a 45-degree angle, and you push in slowly. Now you might notice the clay starts getting sticky, and I even had a little bit of clay come off on my thumb. If that happens, just stop what you're doing. Just a couple drips of water on the inside, and then go back. Anytime you feel the clay get sticky, you need to add more water. And anytime you've got a bunch of mud built up, it's a good idea to just get that sponged away. So, and I've got this shape of a V here, going down to a point, and I'm trying not to go so far down that I go all the way through to the wheel head. I want to leave about 1/4 of an inch of clay. Then I'm going to change my technique, and I'm going to use my fingertips. You can do 2 hands, you can try 1 hand, 2 is probably better. And I'm going to pull this clay out at the very bottom so that it makes a flat base or a flat floor. You want that floor to be as flat as possible, and you want it to be about 1/4 of an inch thick. One way you can tell how thick your floor is to take your needle tool, push it down into your clay until it touches the wheel head, put your finger on the top of the clay surface, and pull that out. And what you have left over is how thick your floor is. So this is about 1/4 of an inch. That would be a good thickness. Now, I do have, it's not totally smooth on the inside. I've got some finger marks, and there's a little bump in there. So what I need to do now is I need to go in and just smooth it out with my sponge and make sure it's nice and flat. Now, before I start the next step, which is pulling, where I bring the walls higher, I need to shape this a little bit better for me to do that. So I'm going to be making a cylinder, so I don't want the top to get very wide. So I'm going to choke this top in, and I'm just using my hands on the sides to push in slowly, and I want to see that top move in toward the middle just a little bit. I don't want it to close off. I just want to narrow it out. So your goal is to have a top that's a little bit narrower than your bottom. Okay, this will help you in your pull. So now my next step is to pull these walls taller. Typically when I'm doing a pull, I hold the sponge in my hand, but I'm not actually pulling with the sponge. I still am using my fingertips for a smaller piece like this. When you're throwing bigger pieces, I would recommend using a sponge to do the first couple pulls. But for this, I just hold the sponge in my hand so that it keeps my clay wet. And I've got my index fingers are touching the clay down at the bottom at about that point. So it's roughly 5 o'clock if you were looking at a clock. Okay, my index fingers are touching right there. My outside fingers are going to touch directly across. So a lot of times beginners, they have this problem where their inside fingers may be touching over here and their outside fingers may be over here, and they're not actually across from each other when you're looking at the cross section of the clay. You've got to make sure your fingers are directly across from each other, and you're going to add a little bit of pressure and slowly bring that clay up to the top. Then when you get to the top, you have to hold that steady for just another couple seconds, and then remove your hands slowly. And when you do a pull, it's always a good idea to take your sponge and just compress this rim a little bit to make sure that it stays nice and round. And you're going to repeat that step until you've got a piece that's nice and tall and thin. So again, I'm pushing in and pinching with my fingertips, and I'm bringing that clay up to the top. When I get to the top, I'm going to hold it for an extra second or two to make sure it stays nice and centered, and take my hands off slow. A lot of times a beginner will do this. They'll finish their pull. And they take their hands off really fast, and you're left with this little wobble, which you don't want. So that's why you always hold that pull at the top for just an extra second to make sure everything stays nice and centered. All right, now my next pull is my third pull. I'm really going to try to get the rest of my height here. Now if you can do your pulls in 3 pulls, that's great. It's probably going to take you more like 5 or 6, or even more sometimes when you're a beginner because you're still learning. So on this pull, I know that I've got a lot of clay down here at the bottom, and I know that up at the top it's about 1/4 of an inch, that's as thin as I would want to go. So when I do this pull, I'm going to use extra pressure down here to thin out the wall at the bottom. And then as I get up about halfway, I'm going to release some of that pressure and continue my pull. And then when I get to the top, I'm going to be using no pressure at all, but I'm going to keep pulling. So it's going to look like this. Okay, I'm lots of pressure down here at the bottom, pulling that clay up. Now I've let off that pressure just a little bit. Now I'm using almost no pressure to finish that pull. And now I've got a wall down here at the bottom that's relatively close to being the same thickness as it is at the top. Okay, so a couple finishing techniques you're going to have to do. First one, if you're making a straight piece, it's good to use the wooden rib. You want to just make sure your rib is wet, and you want to make sure the surface of your clay is wet. And I'm actually going to do a pull with this rib. Now, if you're looking at it from your point of view, you don't want the rib necessarily to be straight on like this. I actually angle the rib back a tiny little bit so that I can touch the surface of the clay from the bottom all the way to the top. I can't really touch the surface of the clay like this, so I don't do that. Okay? So I angle this rib back just a little bit, and I'm still doing kind of a pull where I'm pushing out from the inside, and I'm pushing that clay into the surface of the rib. So if you were to see this from your angle, if you're working on the wheel, it might look like this. So you're pushing that clay out, and that rib is scraping out some of the wet clay and smoothing out the surface, just like that. Now I'll switch over to the metal rib. And the metal rib, again, you use at a 45-degree angle. You don't use this perpendicular. And this works really well to just smooth out the surface and make sure that there's no finger marks and make sure that there's no throwing marks. Like that. Okay, again, from your point of view, you're just going to hold this at a bit of an angle with your fingers on the inside just to even that pressure out, and you start at the bottom and you work your way up. Okay? Now the next step is going to be to cut this rim. So my rim is pretty level, but there's a tiny little wobble. So if you do a piece that has a level rim, you don't need to cut it. But if you do have a little wobble, you got to cut it off with this needle tool. And so when you do this, there's 2 things you can't do. One, you can't push the needle through straight through the side. The needle always has to be pointed at an angle. You also have to always push through your needle to your fingertip. Okay? So beginners, oftentimes they'll try to cut this and they don't have their fingers on the inside. You still have to have a finger right here that you push through to. And beginners oftentimes, there's a lot of things beginners do, but beginners will not push the needle through to where their fingertip is. You're not going to stab yourself. You're just pushing through slowly until it touches your finger. So you're going to support the rim of the piece, and you're just going to push slowly through the side until you're through, and then you can lift that ring of clay off the surface. Now, sometimes you don't lift that ring all the way up. Sometimes, for whatever reason, it might get stuck on the side of your piece. If that happens, stop your wheel, grab the ring, pull it off, set it in your little pile of clay for a recycle when you're done. Okay. Now I've got to fix this top because it's a cut edge. I need to make it a nice finished round edge. So I just get it a little bit wet and I pinch those corners together to make it nice and round. If you were going to use this as a drinking vessel of some kind, you would want that to be round and not a cut edge. Alright, now I've got a little bit of a puddle on the inside, so I'm going to just clean that up before I finish this here. And my last step is to grab my wooden knife and create a bevel at the bottom called an undercut. This is a pretty hard technique to get because it requires your tool to be the perfect angle for you to get the cut. So if you do it right, you should slice right through it pretty easily. If you do it wrong, sometimes what you find is your clay does this. And it doesn't actually cut the clay, it just rolls the clay up on the surface of the piece, which you don't want. So if that happens, stop what you're doing, push that clay back down with your fingertip, call me for help, or change the angle of your cutting tool just a little bit so that it actually slices. Alright, so now I've got to get all this clay, I've got to get that out from underneath. Sometimes you can try to use this thing, but that'll usually push all this clay back into the surface and get stuck back on your piece. So what you do is you take your needle tool, and this is flexible, and you can flex this and slice underneath all that clay, but that might get it stuck back to the piece too. So what I do is I take a little bit of water and I drop a couple drips of water down into that little channel that I made, and now when I slice, that water will prevent that clay from getting stuck, and it comes out nice and easy. You can put that in your pile for recycle. Okay, almost done. I still have kind of a rough edge here that I want to fix, so I'm going to take my sponge and I'm just going to clean up that little corner so that it's nice and smooth. And I noticed underneath there I've got some clay that did not quite come out, so now I'm going to change my use of this tool and just put it in there to sort of gather all that clay that was left underneath there. So now it's nice and smooth down at the bottom. Okay. Traditionally, if you've got something on the wheel, you need to get it cut and taken off the wheel onto another board of some kind. And you want to make sure that when you do this, you've got a board that's close to you so you don't have to pick this up and transport it. You also want to make sure that you've got clean and dry hands. So I need to get this mud off my hands. Usually go to the sink, and I also grab a piece of paper towel. So I'm going to come back and show you that in just a second. Now in my studio, I don't have enough of these bats for every student to have multiples. So if it's close to the end of the class period, when you cut your piece off, you can just remove the bat and leave the piece on there. You don't have to actually touch it. But if you make this one at the front half of class and you need to continue working and you only have one bat, you need to cut it, pick it up, and get it onto your storage board. Okay? Make sure you've got some paper towel. I always put it nice and close to my wheel so it's in my bucket. And I am going to cut with the wire and immediately pick it up. Okay, if you cut with this wire and walk away and get your board and your paper towel, sometimes it's stuck again and you're going to need to cut it again. So don't cut it until you're ready to pick it up. When you cut with the wire, you need to wrap the wire a couple times around your fingertips, and you need to pull that wire as tight as you can get it while you slice through. And I like to put the wire on the far side of the wheel, and I slice through towards myself and keep it as tight as I can while I do that. Then with your clean and dry hands, I'm going to pick up the sides of the piece with my entire hand, but I'm not going to lift it straight up. I'm actually going to peel the bottom open a little, or peel the bottom up a little bit. As soon as I feel that clay start to release, then I can lift it up. And when I lift it up, I want to be very careful not to be distorting the shape because it's really soft. So if I've ribbed the surface and if I've got dry hands, it actually sticks to your hand pretty good. So you peel it, lift it up, and you go right to your board. Once you pick this piece up off the wheel, it's oftentimes going to be a little bit oblong or out of round. So if that happens, you don't want to go back in and try to fix it up here and mess with the rim too much. You can actually fix that by pushing down toward the bottom. You see, when you pick this up and you squish the bottom, that's what gets this to go out of round. So if I want to fix that, I just squish the other parts and try to get it back as close to round as I can. Now, I've also got little tools that I've thrown on the wheel and just bisque fired. little cones that we can push down inside here once this piece is leather hard and fix any more issues with it being round if need be. Okay. At this point, once you've got it on your board, you need to let it dry out a little bit so that you can pick it up and handle it and clean up the bottoms. Whenever you clean up the bottom, it's best for the clay to be dry enough that it's no longer sticky. So like if you touch the side of the piece and it comes off on your fingertips, it's not ready yet. So I'm going to let this piece sit for a couple hours sitting out before I'll come back to it. If I've got to wrap it up at the end of the day or the end of the class period, that's fine, and then I can just check it tomorrow. Alright, so once you've allowed your work to dry a little bit and you can handle it and pick it up without it being sticky, you've got to clean up the bottoms and also get your fingerprints and all the other debris off the surface of the clay. So in order to do that, really all you need is a damp sponge, and I like a dull pencil to sign my name on the bottom. Okay, so when I take this piece off the wheel, a lot of times there's a little bit of a sharp edge here that's left right down here at the bottom. So the first thing that I do is I go around the surface of the clay and I get that a little bit damp, and I don't over wet it. If I over wet it, it could start to crack. And I just take my fingertip and I go in and remove that edge that's there. So my intention is to be using these. I don't want there to be a sharp edge that's going to be cutting up and scratching up a tabletop. Go over it with your sponge, buff out any rough spots, make sure there's no crumb stuck in the bottom, and then you're ready to sign your name. So if your work is leather hard, pencil is perfect. If you have let your work dry out, mine's pretty dry right now, I would just want to soften the surface a little bit with my sponge and then go in and sign. I don't want people to use a needle tool for this. I want you to always try to use a pencil or some other dull tool, because a needle tool will sometimes crack the surface of the clay or even cut through it if it's too thin. Okay? And your walls are all nice and smooth and you've cleaned them up and gotten rid of all your fingerprints from when you picked this up off the wheel. Once you've got that, your work is done.